What's up guys, and in today's video I'm going to be going through owning the chaos in terms of how we're actively implementing chaos in what it is that we're building in Chaos OS. And the mission for these is to show our builds raw and real, to show you the good, the bad, the ugly, and also just to document the mental models and frameworks that we're actively using today so that we can build better into the future, to solve big problems as well, to just solve big messy problems within organizations and businesses, also just to call in visionaries, basically people that get what it is that we're building, and also just to build a network of cool people doing cool things. And how I'm actively owning chaos is broken down into 5 simple steps, of which number one is chaos is fuel, basically saying, hey, chaos isn't a problem, it's raw energy. And with that raw energy, how can we translate it into the solution that we're actively building for, and using that solution and also that fuel to basically ultimately use it to sharpen my edge, to say, hey, what we need to do, we need to build the best possible solution with the tools that we have. In order to do this, we need to embrace chaos, to say, hey, chaos is not a problem, it's a solution that we can build. But in order to do that, we solely just need to understand what chaos is from a fundamental perspective, and say, hey, I built a backup system in 4 hours. Okay, cool, the main system did fail, so now we're building a backup system to say, hey, we expect things to go wrong from time to time, and we also need to have measures in place for things that do for that when things do go wrong, that we ultimately have measures that we have set up in place to say, hey, when things go wrong, we don't have a backup at all. Because one of the things that I found, at least, is if the main thing that you're building or the main solution that you're building crashes, you ultimately just don't have, and you don't have a backup, ultimately you screwed. And you just ultimately just need to have measures in place in terms of systems as well, to say, hey, we need to build redundancy in order to say that, hey, if what we built fails, we ultimately have a backup, and ultimately turn that chaos into a future, to say real-time contingency triggers, to say, hey, do we have measures in case our main feature that we're rolling out or the main system that we're building out fails, and can we track it in real time? Because one of the things is, if you don't have contingency triggers, which is one of the things that we're actively implementing, to say, hey, we need real-time contingency triggers that are set off specifically when we realize that, hey, our system is failing or there's chaos that's imminent, and obviously we're going to need to use a backup. So in order to do this, we ultimately just need triggers that ultimately just alert us to say, hey, this is performing under expectations, and now we need to take a look at that, and saying, hey, the biggest lesson that I have learned from this is chaos is a teacher if you don't run from it, to say, hey, the number one thing with what we're doing is we're going to be dealing with a lot of unknown variables. In order to deal with that, we just need to embrace chaos, to say, hey, no matter what we're facing today, we ultimately just need to embrace, to say, hey, there's always going to be chaos in whatever it is that we're building, and we just need to embrace it and have measures in place so that when we do face it, we ultimately just say, hey, we've done this before, let's go at it again. And we're just so motivated to just say, hey, we're going to tackle it no matter how difficult it is. We may not have the answers straight away, but ultimately, if we have those frameworks and measures in place that we're actively implementing, I know that into the future, we're ultimately just going to be able to solve any problem that comes our way. And so far, it has been working, to say, hey, we need contingency measures and also triggers as well, to say, hey, this specific place is failing because XYZ metric is below our KPI. And ultimately, the first principles question, or the question I like to ask here, is what's the fundamental way chaos can be reframed as an opportunity rather than a threat? Basically asking the question of saying, hey, how can we reframe chaos into an opportunity rather than saying, hey, chaos is a threat, hey, this is failing, turning this is failing to where is the opportunity, or where does the opportunity lie in us doing better in terms of what it is that we're building for the future, and ultimately just understanding that and saying, hey, let's build it no matter what the use case is going to be into the future, or if we mess up, it's okay, but let's just build it and have measures in place so that when there are things that are failing, we ultimately just understand the machine from a fundamental perspective. and which leads into the second point, which is seeing the patterns, saying, hey, chaos looks random, and one of the things is saying, hey, you have massive amounts of data. It may look random, but it's ultimately telling its own story, and you need to understand that story before you start implementing different things. And this is something that I'm actively just always trying to hammer down on and solely just understand until you crack the code, to say, hey, it looks chaos until you crack the code, because each chaos, or what seems like chaos, is ultimately just telling you a story. Is in the sense, like when I first started dealing with data, to saying, hey, this looks random, yes it does, but ultimately it's telling your own story, and you just need to pick up the patterns. And simply by just asking, hey, how do I pick up the patterns, or where's the fundamental aspect, or where's this data coming from a root cause, like where is the first principles thoughts of where this data comes from, ultimately just unlocks that perspective that I didn't have. And then it ultimately allows us to map it in a way that allows us to win in terms of what it is that we're building into the future. Because mapping out is one of the most important things, but you can't start mapping out if you don't solely understand what the chaos looks like, and you need to hammer down in terms of what it is that the chaos looks like. And this is also what we're actively just trying to implement and learn, to say, hey, chaos looks random, but ultimately we need to understand it in order to map out the solutions that we're ultimately doing. And so far it's been going pretty well. I know that there's always room and margins that we could be improving, but ultimately into the future, I know that this is only just gonna build up what it is that we're gonna be building into the future, to just solely just hammer down and still be on the trenches in this, and say, hey, we just actively need to keep on doing this. And how I'm actively doing this is, hey, studying 3 planners meltdowns, spotted 5 chaos triggers, to say, hey, we're actively studying, we're actively learning, we're actively trying to implement what it is that we're doing, to say, hey, vendor delays, saying, hey, a lot of people are late in terms of, vendors are late in terms of getting products and supplies to the venues, and saying, hey, this is a universal problem as well. It doesn't specifically have to be in terms of vendors, but saying, hey, they have these problems. And also scope creep, to say, hey, things may come up that we may have not planned for, and now it's just asking the questions of saying, hey, how do we ultimately just plan for that into the future, and what measures are in place? Because ultimately just understanding that from a first principles perspective ultimately has led us to a new understanding that ultimately guides us in terms of building out the solutions that we're actively building out, and actively building out Killer Chaos OS to flag out those patterns early, to say, hey, these are the specific patterns based on the data that we're picking up, and we ultimately just say, hey, if we have this specific client avatar that we're building for, and we have so many other builds that we need to do, ultimately by having certain triggers that are universal, we can ultimately spot it and say, hey, we need to make sure XYZ is in place before we actively just building what it is that we're building. And also the biggest lesson that I have learned from this is, mastery starts with understanding the beast being what it is that we're building, the data, the numbers behind that, and ultimately how to make sure that everything correlates in terms of how we're building that into the future and building it for scale as well. Ultimately saying, hey, is this solution gonna last 5-10 years? And ultimately just building specifically for the future, and saying, hey, we're ultimately building based off of what we know, saying, hey, scope creep does happen, this is something that is inevitable most of the case, but how do you then produce measures in place in order to combat that? And asking the first principles question of saying, hey, what are the root causes of chaos in my current system, and how do I address them from their source? Saying, hey, what are the active chaos that is within the system, and how do we implement this into addressing it at its source? And just understanding that ultimately just brings a new perspective that we didn't have. And this is something that I'm actively seeking truth for, because one of the things is we're actively pushing the team to say, hey, we need to seek for truth. And how do we do that? We ask the questions of saying, hey, what is the root cause in my chaos in this current system, that ultimately allows us to address them at the source. And always seeking truth at the source ultimately just allows us to provide the solution that we are providing for, and also build it in a manner that allows us to scale it into the future, which ultimately leads us to then build to the third point, which is built in the storm. And why this is key is waiting for the calm is a myth, saying, hey, we're just going to wait for times to be calmer before we start implementing certain things, or before we start saying, hey, the solution is ready, now we can implement a perfect solution. The idea of a perfect solution doesn't exist. You only know those questions, or you only know the answer once you've started building. And ultimately, building means that you're just actively doing things and striving for results, because that is the number one thing that you need to do, to say, hey, we need to strive for results, and we need to make sure that we're building Killer Chaos OS in chaos, so that we specifically understand that, hey, there's so many variables that come to play, but ultimately we're going to solve those variables, not just for today, but also for tomorrow. And how I'm doing this is saying, hey, we demoed a scheduler while fielding 10 clients, and saying, hey, we're actively building this solution specifically for them, and we're also just having that inbox and pipeline to say, hey, let's build a pipeline, let's actively just show what it is that we're building into the future, and also just get feedback from that. And tested it live with the planners to say, hey, we're testing this solution out with our clients to say, hey, does this work, does it not work, and are we providing enough value in terms of what it is that we're building, and actively just getting the data off of that, and ultimately just allowing us to build it in a manner that, like I said, that is scalable and also addresses the problem at its root cause. And the biggest lesson that I have learned from this is pressure is where legends are formed, to say, hey, no matter what it is that we're doing, we're just going to make sure that we understand that, hey, pressure is where we are best at, and we need to be able to cope under pressure, because ultimately what it is that we're solving is chaos, and chaos has a lot of pressure. So if we can't feel pressure in what it is that we're building, how else are we going to build it for someone else? And just ultimately saying, hey, no matter what the storm is, we're going to build for it, and we're going to build into the future for it, and we're going to put in place measures that ultimately just allow us to have these measures that ultimately say, hey, even though we're building in chaos, we have measures that reduce that chaos, and ultimately allow us to build the best possible solution for our clients that we possibly can, and also iterate on that moving on into the future. So it's not just a one and done, we say, hey, we've built it. No, we prefer to build client relationships where we say, hey, we want to be with you in the long term. We just don't want to build it out for you. We just want to build this for today and tomorrow and the near future, and also the long-term vision of what your business is. And ultimately thinking or asking the first principles question of, what are the essential skills or tools that I need to perform at my best when chaos strikes? Basically having those measures, like I mentioned, in place to say, hey, when chaos strikes, what it is that we're going to be doing, and how we're going to go through those times with the measures that we have in place. That's where SOPs and just documentation comes in super handy, because you ultimately, each build, you're ultimately just getting feedback from that, and you're ultimately saying, hey, we just ultimately need to build what it is that we're building, and we need to get as much feedback as we possibly can from the previous build, to in order for us to build better products into the future. And which ultimately leads to the fourth point, which is chaos as a weapon. And why this is key is, I'm not just surviving chaos, I'm wielding it to stand out, to say, hey, what it is that we're building is not just for our clients, it's mainly used as a tool in order to give them a competitive advantage, to say, hey, our main build principles or ideas as we're building this is, how can we build as much leverage within their core business functions that ultimately allows them to scale into the future and differentiate what it is that they're actively doing from their competition. And how I'm doing this is saying, hey, building a one-of-a-kind solution, saying, hey, what's the solution that we're building? Your competition does not have it. You are the only person that has the solution, and ultimately this is going to be your competitive edge over them. Say for example, they're using off-the-shelf tools, and everyone is going to be using that in that specific field. So where's the differentiation in terms of what you're doing and what everyone else is doing? If for example you own a private jet company and you say, hey, we're just going to plug in XYZ into our business, but then the other the competition or the business that's at the top is ultimately just implementing live tracking, fuel supply management and all these other extra measures that are custom built in-house. Ultimately they're going to have a competitive advantage that you're not, and you ultimately not going to scale to the level that they're going to scale simply because they have that custom infrastructure built in place. So we want to ultimately just say, hey, we want to build a one of a kind solution that plays into your specific core business functions and also serves you in order for you to be the best and be the best in your market, and ultimately just allow them to scale into the future, which Chaos Killer OS thrives on, where others fail, to say, hey, we're building a one of a kind solution, and I am super bullish on this to say, hey, if we build this out for you, you have a one of a kind solution that ultimately differentiates you and ultimately acts as a core function within your business. And that is not easy most of the time, to say, hey, we're building something that is going to be integral into a core business function, and then it just becomes asking the question of saying, hey, how can we make sure we do this but do it to the best of our abilities? Not just do it just saying, hey, we've built this, let's just give it to them, but saying, hey, how can we build it, refine it, and scale it into the future? And the biggest lesson that I have learned here is chaos is your own flex when you own it, to say, hey, we need to own what our chaos is, and we need to own the chaos for our companies that we're working with, and saying, hey, we own it, now we're going to help you scale it. And the first principles question that I like to ask here is, how can I leverage chaos in a way that sets me apart from my competition? Saying, hey, the business or the clients that we work with, how can they differentiate from the competition with the chaos that they have? And ultimately just building a one of a kind solution allows them to scale into the future. And I'm super bullish on this, and I still believe into the future this is still going to play an integral role into the clients that we're going to be working with, and also the infrastructures that we're going to be setting up as well, especially also into the future with now the rise of AI. If only you're building specific solutions tailored to your business with that in mind, and also using it as a surface layer, you ultimately just going to build a solution or a business that runs like a software company, and that allows you to differentiate from the competition and create leverage, most importantly. And which ties into the fifth point that ties everything up all together, is chaos keeps me sharp, because comfort kills the hustle. When we think that, hey, we're coasting, that's ultimately when comfort creeps in, and that kills the hustle ultimately long term, because, hey, we're getting comfortable, we think that, hey, what it is that we're doing is good enough. But no, that's not the case. You can always do more, and striving for that ultimately pushes us to say, hey, we need to provide the best possible service in terms of our onboarding, in terms of our offboarding, in terms of the client process, in terms of saying, hey, the feedback loops are our feedback loops in the manner that promotes feedback that is both scalable into the future and that actually helps us build. And just asking those questions ultimately just gets us closer to our source of truth, and saying, hey, chaos keeps me on my toes, to say, hey, we need to be on our toes, constantly keep learning, iterating, and saying, hey, to learn what it is that we're actively building today, and implement what it is that we're learning today into the future, and constantly never take our foot off the gas. And nightly recaps saying, hey, chaos, what chaos did I conquer today, and how is it going to fuel tomorrow's mission? And saying, hey, every mess I master gets me closer to the empire that we are building, which is solving chaos in the long term. And saying, hey, what it is that we're building is ultimately just gonna let us scale into the future. And the big lesson is, chaos is grind's best friend, to say, hey, if we're grinding so hard, we know that chaos is not too far behind, if not they're together. And ultimately just having that open mind to say, hey, what it is that we're building, chaos and grind is gonna go hand in hand, and ultimately help us build into the future. It's ultimately just gonna give us a perspective that allows us to then say, hey, we ultimately just are striving to solve chaos, and we need to break it down into first principles, which ultimately allows us to ask the questions of saying, hey, what is the core purpose that keeps me driven even when chaos feels overwhelming? Because most of the time it is going to feel overwhelming, and no one, or at least I like to think of it, is subject to this. this. Even I do most of the time, to say, hey, we might feel overwhelmed in what it is that we're building, but how do we then say, hey, we need to make sure that we remember what the purpose is, the core purpose of what it is that we're doing, and for what it is that we're doing is ultimately to provide value and to solve chaos within businesses and organizations, and saying, hey, this keeps me driven, it keeps me motivated to say, hey, let me wake up in the morning and be ready to take on the day, simply because I'm super motivated and pumped to be solving problems, because also solving problems is ultimately part of the core purpose of what it is that we're doing, to solve problems that ultimately scale into the future. And I'm super bullish that this is only just going to double as we go, and it's only going to allow us to build better mental models and frameworks into the future that ultimately just allow us to scale our operations and also the clients that we're working with. And if you guys enjoyed this video, make sure to connect with me on X, Instagram, LinkedIn, and I'll see you guys in the next video.